part of looking at strategic Bitcoin reserves. And I'm really, really keen for our panel to get stuck into it today. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Stafford, over to you.
Okay, I think let's keep it short. I'm Stafford Masie. I am a technology investor. I'm a Bitcoin maxi and chairman of a company called AltVest Capital in South Africa. One of the first organizations, or the first organization in South Africa listed on a stock exchange that announced the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Very proud of the team that did that, and very proud that we were the first in Africa to do so.
Absolutely. And James, welcome, James.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cath. Yeah, I'm James Core. Simple, we'll keep it short. I own Simple Bitcoin Services, and we are a consultant, especially around strategic Bitcoin reserves. We've been doing that for about 6 years now, since Taproot, and helping not just individuals, but corporates and even JSE-listed firms to set up the correct strategies around Bitcoin custody, brokerage, execution, OTC desk in South Africa, and custody around the world.
Amazing, guys. So really, I'm really grateful to you guys for your time for us to discuss this. I want to just hit us off first with a really big point. Something that you've said to us in an earlier chat, Stafford, which I think is really important, is that the key term is strategic Bitcoin reserve. So we're not just speaking about buying Bitcoin to support an economy, etc. Specifically for an emerging economy, we're looking at utility too. Can you extrapolate for me just a little bit about your viewpoint on that very key part of a strategic Bitcoin reserve?
I think when you take a look at Bitcoin from an emerging markets perspective, I'm sitting in New York City right now in a hotel room, and I've met with some Bitcoiners here in the United States. Many of them bankers. They're not really Bitcoiners, they're bankers. And many of them struggle with the base level utility aspects of Bitcoin. They just don't like, what do I do with this thing? Why should I own this thing? It's very interesting when you look at Bitcoin from a non-emerging markets perspective and you look at it from like a G8 perspective. It's difficult to conceptualize. But when you sit in a country like South Africa, where external monetary decisions and debasements affect you all the way on the ground, all the way through to your corporation and the status of your currency from a forex perspective and the value of your currency. I mean, in South Africa, we feel it on the ground. In South Africa, groceries are getting more expensive, and people are complaining, saying everywhere, well, groceries are getting more expensive, but no, your money is getting weaker. And when you kind of look at it through that perspective, then you start understanding the utility on a ground level in South Africa. And I think in any emerging economy in the world, if you ask someone on the street in South Africa, and that's why you see the adoption, the way it looks like on the ground in South Africa. And what's beautiful about Bitcoin is the guy in Soweto or in Eldorado Park, where I grew up in South Africa, has the ability to acquire this asset quicker, better than large enterprises have that need people like James, because they need to understand how to custody this thing, what to do with key management and etc. as a corporation. So if you take a look at it from a strategic perspective, the reason AltVest Capital did it, well, we're looking at the global monetary framework. We're looking at uncertainty in the markets. We're looking at foreign influences on the South African rand. We look at inflation. We look at control. We look at fiscal discipline as a company displaying fiscal discipline, true control over the asset that we own. In South Africa, what's very scary is that we have between 1.7 and 2.1 trillion sitting in cash in corporations, not deployed, because corporations have political uncertainty. They're dealing with risks that an economy like the United States or the UK or I think Europe's starting to feel it, but in South Africa, it's been acute for decades now, where we understand that political inclinations affect a company's strategy, affect a company's ability to utilize its funds and its assets in a strategic manner. So I do think a South African corporation sitting with a strategic Bitcoin reserve, the baseline utility is showing fiscal discipline. You've de-risked the organization, and you've got control. You've got control back. And for me, that is an incredible utility for a company that's listed through to a family sitting in South Africa. I've always said South Africans, if you're a leader in your family, if you're the person that's owning the wealth and gaining the capital in your family, it is your responsibility to understand this asset, just as it is for our CEO Warren Wheatley and AltVest Capital to understand this asset, just like it is for the South African Reserve Bank governor to understand this asset and what it means for the country, because its utility is not dissimilar on every single level, and that's the beauty of the asset.
I completely agree, Stafford. Thank you so much for that. That was so insightful. So, James, I wanted to ping over to you. Obviously, as a specialist in Bitcoin custody solutions, and it's something that is so, again, it reflects back to Stafford's points about education, basic education, those kinds of things. You've walked that journey with so many people, I imagine. And with so many organizations. What a privilege. Well done. I'm pretty sure that their investments are very secure. So for me, I wanted to look at it, hear from you a little bit about, in terms of the emerging economies and emerging markets, something you said was that very often the creation of a strategic Bitcoin reserve happens from the bottom up. And when we chatted, I spoke about my favorite example, Bhutan, where they've been Bitcoin mining for years using hydroelectric power. So give me a little bit of your thoughts on that, about that bottom up approach. Obviously, there's institutional and from governmental. The US is making huge rah-rah.
Yeah,
So
that's a great point, Cath. Thank you. I think it's very interesting to see that the wealth of a nation can be held in the people's hands or in the government's hands, and a lot of it's held in the individuals in the country, the companies, the corporates, and the enterprises. And so, as a country, every person, every company, every institution, every municipality or state, and then every government institution that buys and holds Bitcoin grows the reserve of that country. And it's not just happening. The Bitcoin adoption is not happening from the top down. It's been happening from the bottom up. And Stafford covered this quite nicely in his review of the Bitcoin price, one of Stafford's worst possible topics. But we're at the $1.7 trillion market cap point, and SAFE proposes that at this point, corporate treasuries are starting to look at the asset as something reasonable, worthwhile engaging with. So I think that's quite an important way to consider strategic reserve assets. I am passionate about helping every family, every individual to have a strategic reserve in Bitcoin, and I have done for a decade. But the reality of it is we have now the right policies, structures in place to help fiduciary and financially fiscal responsible people to actually set up the right strategies to buy Bitcoin and hold it, or and this is what you were alluding to, the power of using other strategies, those budget neutral strategies such as mining and other really incredibly easy ways to implement Bitcoin procurement. And so, mining is something I know Stafford is phenomenally experienced in at the moment. And if we can get countries to start mining Bitcoin and growing their Bitcoin reserves, like Bhutan has done, that, and I think in Bhutan, their reserve is something like 28% of the GDP. So, they've really pulled off an amazing coup before the rest of the world has even woken up. I wonder who could be next in terms of this adoption of Bitcoin.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James. It's on my vision board to go and visit. And I want to make a documentary there with my team at Cointelegraph. Stafford, something that we do get, something that comes up a lot in our Cointelegraph coverage is obviously the US adopting a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And in many, many ways, the US can serve as a sort of model for emerging economies to follow. Now, an emerging economy is extremely different to a developed economy. And I'm going to say developing. I've got many different perspectives on that. But can you explain a little bit more about how the US could serve as a model, particularly for emerging economies from a regulatory perspective?
Look, I think what they did, what I love what the United States did was they parted the waters in terms of crypto versus Bitcoin. You know, we had all these, like, lack of a better term, these shit coins that keep flying around Bitcoin all the time, and they sparkly, shiny things that distract people from the core. I'm in the movie of, like Michael Saylor says, there's only one. And I love what David Sachs said when they announced their strategic Bitcoin reserve. He termed the phrase the immaculate conception, and that is Bitcoin. Bitcoin stands alone. It is unique. There is only one. If you try to put it into this crypto basket of things, I think, you know, crypto and fiat, you deal with them on their own. I think
Mm.
Bitcoin's separate. So I think the first thing that I valued from that move in the United States was the fact that they separated Bitcoin from crypto, and they did it quite smartly. And we were very worried when they announced it, because the first iterations that we heard about on Twitter, etc., on X, was it was going to be a basket of crypto assets. And, you know, we just sat there shell shocked, because we thought, oh my word, clearly they don't understand it, clearly they don't get it. And luckily, the leadership in the United States, and I think that's very key. Before we go into what they did, was the leadership that Trump has coagulated around his administration relative to this, have core insights. They've got experience. And I think if you're going to do it on a country level, that's what you require. You know, if you've got fiat maxis or you've got traditional leaders in
Mm.
government, it's going to be real difficult to put this together, because you've got contrasting views. But what Trump's got is a group of human beings that are leading. They understand the asset, they understand the difference,
You're
and
right.
the strategic reserve clearly articulated that. So step one is they gave us that framework. So Bitcoin's different. So Bitcoin goes into the strategic reserve. We have this other asset stockpile, and we'll either sell that to buy Bitcoin, or we'll sell that and do something else with it, or we'll reallocate it. So that's very interesting. They also created a model for in two ways: dollar cost average into it, and the other one was to do it in a budget neutral way. And I think that's
Yes.
really smart. And this is what we've been arguing for in South Africa, is that we don't want the South African government to take 50% of our gold, oil, all the other commodities that we have, and then shove them into Bitcoin. No, you kind of dollar cost average into this thing. So their dollar cost averaging strategy is the Loomis bill, that says, hey, we're going to buy 1 million Bitcoins over 5 years in these tranches. And that's being deliberated right now. And we'll see if that's enacted. And that's an interesting way to dollar cost average into it. So they're taking confiscated assets, they're reallocating it into the reserve. So they'll sit with approximately just under 200,000 Bitcoins. They will dollar cost average into it. We're making it very clear that they're going to acquire. And I love that strategy. And it may not apply to a country like South Africa. But if South Africa took like a 1% allocation, 1%, and we said,
Once.
okay, of our 1% of our reserves, we're going to dollar cost average, and we're going to create a dollar cost averaging strategy, whether that is an announcement that we're going to buy X over a period of time. Is one way to do it. Maybe we don't announce it. Maybe there's certain milestones on a price basis. Doesn't really matter. So what we
Yes.
see as a recategorization. So clear, Bitcoin's the only one. Number two is there's a dollar cost average strategy. Number three is that there's this budget neutral way of doing it. And I'm loving what I'm seeing in the United States around this budget neutrality, right? So it is taking gold certificates that are ancient and maybe liquidating them. That's one way. But what I love more is this notion of bit bonds, as actually taking the 5-year and the 10-year treasuries and mixing them up with Bitcoin. So if you buy a 10-year, 80% of the cost is fiat. You buy it, and 10% goes towards the acquisition of Bitcoin. And
Mm.
over the period of time, the performance of that portion of the acquisition is then split between government and the person that originally bought the bond. I love this notion of a bit bond. This is something that's being done on the ground in the United States by people offering long-term mortgages, where your mortgage is de-risked by allocating a percentage of it to Bitcoin. And as the Bitcoin grows, it may outperform your mortgage and it may settle your mortgage. But whatever the case is, over 10-year term, if you look at Bitcoin's performance, over 5 to 10-year period, then you start seeing it's pretty obvious from a price perspective that this makes sense. So we
Absolutely.
continue to watch the United States. Is there a notion where we could take our treasuries, our bonds, our South African government bonds, our debt, which right now is under threat? Our debt is heavily owned by the big United States debt purchasers, right? So the big banks, the big hedge funds are owning large portions of our debt. So could we mix that up with some Bitcoin? I think that's an interesting thing for us to consider, and I think we should be doing that. But stepping all the way back, if you're to look at the pure principle framework here, you need to have leadership that gets this. Now, what I'm doing in my personal capacity, what we're doing as AltVest Capital, we are working with our leadership in the country to make them understand these basics. And unfortunately, as Bitcoin maxis, we're very impatient. We want these things to move. We want them to happen quickly. But a lot of it is education. And Bitcoin doesn't have a chief marketing officer. Bitcoin doesn't have a CEO.
No.
Bitcoin doesn't have a strategy office. So
No.
Bitcoin requires people like myself, people like James. Yeah, it's simple B. I mean, I call on James a lot when people want to know, okay, wait a minute, I've got a company. I want to create this strategic reserve asset. How do I do key management? That's when I will call James, and James will take them through the custodial procedures, the multi-sig wallets, and how you can do it as a corporation. But when you get, what we need to do as South Africans is to continue engaging with SARB, continue to engage the South African Reserve Bank, continue to engage with the Intergovernmental Financial Working Group, the IFWG, which we have done. And guess what? What's amazing is that the IFWG, based upon us engaging with them, and when I say us, this is the team at AltVest Capital, this is some of the other folks within IFWG. What I love is that our doors are not closed. They opened up the door, and they actually changed the clause over the last few weeks. So we used to have a policy suggestive clause that were published by the IFWG that stopped an organization from listing a security on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange backed by crypto asset of any kind. That clause has fallen away.
Which
right?
is
So they say
huge news
it's
for South Africa.
huge. It's huge.
Huge.
But no
Huge.
one has announced it. No one has spoken about it, and that's okay.
Well, here we go.
You know, but I
Breaking
think what's going to
news.
be, what's going to be more important is if we can now work with the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and we can work with the FSCA in South Africa to get them over the hurdle, because what we're still dealing with in those organizations and in those governance and legislative frameworks is crypto. And this is so frustrating. Like, can we separate them? And we're just talking about Bitcoin, and that's and so it requires education, it requires engagement, and this is what we're doing. And I think AltVest Capital is pioneering this in lots of ways, by not just announcing a strategic Bitcoin reserve, but also working with the JSE, with the FSCA, all the legislators to articulate the differences, to articulate why Bitcoin makes sense, and to enable us to list classes of shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange backed by Bitcoin, which we think, and we could have another MicroStrategy in South Africa. Why not? It makes a lot of sense. And I think we need that. Yeah, exactly. So, and we need it. We need it because, MicroStrategy is important, because not every, ETFs are important. Exchanges are important. MicroStrategy is important because everyone has a different framework around how they want to get exposed to this asset. Some want ETFs. They don't want to deal with keys and talk to James and these guys, right? They don't want wallets and Trezors and USB sticks, and for them that's just weird, right? Or they literally they're governed and they can't do it. So what they'll do is they'll either buy ETFs or they'll buy a MicroStrategy that gives them exposure to the asset. So we think there's an opportunity in South Africa to create an asset class on the exchange that's exposed to Bitcoin, that allows pension funds through to an individual that is not a cypherpunk technology person to get exposure to the asset. And I think it's good for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. I think it's good for the population, the civilians in South Africa. This is good for the country. This is really, really good for South Africa if we enable these things.
Stafford, ultimately what's happening there is facilitating utility beyond what are we worried about the market price, because I know the market price is your pet peeve. James, something that we spoke about in our pre-sessions was that you made this statement, and I actually wrote it down. You said this is the greatest opportunity. What was your exact words were? The greatest opportunity we've ever seen in terms of supporting an emerging economy. Please, can you elaborate on that for me? I mean, I agree with you. I completely agree with you. This is the most exciting time. And for my work that I do at Cointelegraph, it is such an exciting thing to see more and more of these stories coming out where we're talking about the emerging economies, and we're talking about, Nigeria has a higher crypto adoption rate on the ground, and it's peer-to-peer payments and all of that. So tell me more about the greatest opportunity we've ever seen, because that was it had such an influence on my thinking.
Well, thanks, Cath. I must be careful what I say. But
I'll write everything down.
It absolutely is, because I think the strategic reserve that Trump announced in his executive order still has to go through the Senate, all the way through the American legislature before it is a real thing. Although they are holding Bitcoin, and Cynthia Lummis's bill is the next step in that process. But us emerging economies have an opportunity to move faster. So there's a massive opportunity right now. And as Saif was saying, when Bitcoin's at a $1.7 trillion market cap, to really make an impactful investment into this asset class. But why? Why is Bitcoin so important? You've got digital scarcity. You've got a money that's not controlled by anybody else. And I think I was really speaking into that, the story of the Russian US dollar treasury reserves.
Yes.
They'd been, at the beginning of the war with Ukraine, the US and other nations confiscated all of Russia's dollar reserves. And those dollar reserves are now sitting in the US government's hands. And although they're trying to change some legislation which will allow them to use those reserves, what they are doing is they are absorbing all of the interest earned off those reserves to pay and fund the Ukrainian government in the war. So those reserves, Russia thought were theirs, and instantly they were confiscated and taken away. I know that in emerging markets, ownership of an asset is something we don't really understand. We use other people's debt and other people's money. Bitcoin is the world's first asset and money that you can actually own. And you can know definitively how much of it you own and where it is, and be able to do things like El Salvador has done, grow a reserve that allows you the benefit of negotiating with the IMF, being able to repay a loan, etc. These things are mind-blowing for emerging markets. And one of the lovely, fantastic things about the work Staff is doing and AltVest are doing is they're setting a precedent in not just in South Africa, but on the whole continent. That they're showing African nations and African companies that we can engage in Bitcoin. So that's one element of it. And of course, my element of it is always going down to the man on the street. Anybody, as Stafford said, any financially responsible person in the country, in the world, on the continent, can start to absorb a little bit of the Bitcoin 21 million coins, a few Satoshis, save a million Satoshis.
Absolutely.
And just hold that. And that really becomes really empowering in the long term. When I work with guys on the ground, the laboring class, they no longer save. They don't consider saving as something worth doing. Their purchasing power of the money they save is disintegrating faster than they can possibly save the money to buy the thing they were saving for. And when we start saving into Bitcoin, and we tell them it's not a get rich quick, this is a grow your wealth slowly strategy. After 5 to 8 years, my first guy I did that with is now been saving in Bitcoin for 9 years. And he's working half day because he wants to. He's basically retired. It's a crazy story, but his standard of living hasn't gone up crazy like madness. He's just got a sound money as a foundation for his life. And that's the opportunity that all of us need to be aware of. It's a once in a lifetime chance to buy Bitcoin under $1 million.
Absolutely.
Cath, I want to chime in on this the greatest opportunity aspect too. And I think James is talking about it on us as like institutions like AltVest Capital. He's talking about the individual on the street. But if you take a look at the opportunity that Bitcoin mining presents to a country, around grid stability. But a lot of people don't understand that aspect of Bitcoin. So they see Bitcoin as a two-sided coin, right? They look at it from a price, money go up, money go down perspective. Those discussions are interesting, but once you start fleshing out, you'll understand that this asset is just the most undervalued asset in the entire world. And it's not just because of the fiat aspect of it. It is when you go look at the other side of the coin, you start looking at Bitcoin from a protocol perspective, proof of work. And when you understand Bitcoin mining, so I've been working with Saab, with the IFWG, with AltVest, working with the JSE and all of that. But the other work that we're doing is with Eskom. And we have an Eskom. If you take a look at exactly. So we have a big issue in South Africa around grid instability. We have issues around South Africa around getting renewables working in our country, in investment in those areas. Guess what? I've been working extensively in a company called Bitmac. We haven't announced the company. This is the first time I'm talking about this company in a public forum. So Bitmac is a company that I founded with a few individuals and some ex-Eskom engineers. And these individuals really, really understand Bitcoin mining really well. And what we are working with Eskom, and we're in the application process right now, we've put forward to deploy a 500 megawatt to a 1 gigawatt Bitcoin deployment in South Africa. And if you take a look at what this will do for the grid, this is several things. It stabilizes the grid, right?
Absolutely.
So if you take a look at the
Load
way,
shedding.
well, I think I don't know about Baba load shedding, but what we can do, we can have a net impact that's quite profound around grid frequency stabilization, right? So demand stabilization right now is a big challenge. Go look at Eskom's website. It's clear the demand management program is published. They're struggling with this. So in terms of the duck curve, when we're using energy, when we don't use energy, the deployment of renewables, getting those things onto the grid, it's a big challenge for Eskom. So they're all over the place. We've articulated to them in very verbose documentation what the value propositions are for deploying a system like a Bitcoin mine that has a few attributes. The beauty of a Bitcoin mine is it has the ability to take megawatts to gigawatts of power instantaneously and give it back, i.e. switch off from the grid instantaneously. And that ability to shed excess power, curtailed power, onto a Bitcoin mine and then take it back to them essentially stabilizes the frequency of the grid. This has enormous implications around grid maintenance, cost of equipment, breakages, etc. This is massive, and Bitcoin's going to have that impact. Second thing is Bitcoin Bitcoins, which means Eskom can start generating a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Now, we did some studies that were published out. We mentioned it in the last Bitcoin conference, Carl, the author, and myself. If Eskom had started Bitcoin mining in 2020, they would have paid off their debt 1st of January this year, and they would have sat with a surplus of almost R500 million. That's extraordinary, right? So that's the one thing. And then if you take a look at it, this is the other side of Bitcoin mining. It's not just the money, it's not just the grid stabilization, it's not just the instantaneous attributes. But you know what's amazing about it? It has such an impact on agri-tech. So we're working with an organization that's contracted to Eskom, where we're going to take the hot water that comes from a Bitcoin mine. So Bitcoin mines immerse, the affluent is it's water. It's got no pollution. The only thing that it gives off is two things: heated air and heated water. And guess what? When you want to deploy an aquaponics farm, if you want to do tropical fish farming in Mpumalanga, if you want to do a thermal soil heating, if you want to create greenhouses, you take a Bitcoin mine and you take the water that pours through it. And when it comes out the other side, it's 50 to 80 degrees Celsius, depending on what the reticulation. Imagine the agricultural impact. And guess what? The society that sunsetted the coal mine, that don't have jobs anymore, we can repurpose them. We can bring them into agriculture, expose them to a Bitcoin mine, and we have this agri-tech play. So if you look at that side of Bitcoin, that to me is more interesting. In my opinion, and I've said it to James before in many forums, I believe what Bitcoin will do for the energy markets will dwarf what it will do for the monetary fiat markets, in my opinion.
I love that. I love that. And I know that we have to wrap up. I wish I could talk about this all day with you guys, but I know that we only have limited sessions. So thank you so much, Stafford, for your time and your insights. James, for your time and your insights. It's been such a great panel and such a great conversation starter too, because while so much is happening in the developed world, the emerging economies present such incredible opportunities and so many good examples. I mean, I can think of, we're just thinking about Bitcoin mining. I think about what's happening in Namibia and in so many other places in partnership with Gridless. And I'm really, really privileged that I get to see so many of these stories up front at Cointelegraph. So I feel very, it's wonderful to see it behind the scenes just before we hit publish. Ultimately, establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve for emerging economies is an absolute yes, an absolute yes. My ultimate statement would not be, when are you doing it or how are you doing it? It would be, do it. And I think that is the message that we need to keep having, and we need to keep conversing with people to keep that education going at every level of society, you know, at a personal level for you, James, and Stafford for all of the work that you're doing at governmental and in corporate level. We've got to keep that conversation going, because the Bitcoin conversation is ultimately one that leads to so much and can be, as you said, James, the greatest opportunity for all of us. Thank you so much for joining me on this panel. It's been great. Thank you to everyone who's attending this fabulous conference, and to Bitcoin events, because you are fabulous. Tanya and her team are fabulous organizers, and it's been so wonderful to chat. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Ciao.